This talk is on identifying garden birds, how to identify a garden bird. You're not going to come away at the end of this being able to identify every species of bird that comes into your garden, because there are so many. We'd be here for days going through them all. But I would like you to go away at the end of this talk with some pointers to show you how to identify birds that visit your garden. There's a method to it. This is my method. Other bird watchers might use slightly different methods. You need a structure to it if you want to, improve your identification skills. And with that, you gain more enjoyment out of the birds in your garden. Because usually when you start, you think there's only 2 or 3 species. But when you spend some time just looking at them a little bit closer, recording the details of what they look like, things like that, you'll actually be quite amazed to discover that all along you may have had 10 or maybe even 15 species of birds visiting your garden, and not just the 2 or 3 that you thought you had. So I've put together the top 30 Irish winter garden birds. So I'm going to be focusing on the birds that come to your garden during the winter. So I won't be covering the swallow or any of the warblers like the chiff-chaff and that in this talk. It's primarily the winter garden birds. And these are the top 30 based on last year's results of the Birdwatch Ireland Garden Bird Survey. Don't panic. I'm going to go through them in groups and give you pointers and ideas for going about identifying them. Even from looking at this slide, you can see that some of them are very distinctive and easy to identify. And then there's others, and they all kind of look kind of the same. So I'm going to break it down, and that's what you do. Break it down and take them one at a time. And that's the way we all learned to birdwatch. We started identifying a few very obvious ones, and then we noticed ones that were not quite so obvious, and we learned those, okay? So just like my last talk, for those of you who joined me last week, I think the notebook is probably the most important thing to have. And if you have the notebook, you can have it in the kitchen. You can have it on the table somewhere on the windowsill. Now, when you get a bird like this coming to your feeding area or somewhere else in the garden, how do you describe a bird like this? I mean, I've had phone calls from people over the years, and I'm trying to make a mental picture of what they're describing, and sometimes it sounds like a peacock or a parrot, and it turns out to be this, which is a chaffinch. But I'm telling you, instead of going straight for the identification guide, what you should do, make a quick sketch showing the shape of the beak, the shape of the tail, and then pointing out the key colors on the bird, the mystery bird that you have in front of you. I've 11 words written on this piece of paper, and these, along with my very basic diagram. It's not a work of art. It doesn't need to be a work of art. You don't have to be able to draw a simple diagram like this one, just to show the general shape of the bird, the features that stood out, and where the colors were. And I've got everything I need to identify this bird as a chaffinch. So I would strongly urge and encourage you to start taking quick notes of the main features of the birds you know already, because you'll be surprised the details that you don't actually see sometimes because you're so familiar with them. And it's great practice, because when you do get a bird in your garden that you don't know how to identify, you'll know how to go about it. Because I'll tell you, if you decide, like a lot of people do when they're starting out, to take out your garden bird book and look through it to try and find the bird that you've just seen that you can't identify, by the time you find something that looks like it, your bird will be gone, and your memory will start playing tricks on you, because you'll have a page with a number of birds on it maybe. In this particular guide, it's 1 species per page, but still species illustrated in your identification guide, they'll start looking quite similar, and you'll probably misidentify it by just going straight to the guide. So make a quick sketch if you can, write down the essential features, the colors and the patterns and things like that. and the general shape and size of the bird. If you don't have a notebook ready or with you, you can always use your phone and record the details. You could do it that way. But once you have the essential information down, then go to your identification guide. A pair of binoculars can help an awful lot with identification of birds in your garden. So a small little palm-sized pair like this can be really handy, and it does really expand your enjoyment of the birds you have in your garden, because when you see the details of plumage, colors and patterns and the shapes of the birds with the binoculars, it's fantastic. And most binoculars now, you can use them with your glasses. There's a little eye relief cup that you can adjust so that you don't have to take your glasses off to look through them. Birdwatch Ireland have an excellent selection of binoculars chosen by birdwatchers for birdwatchers on their online shop. That's at birdwatchireland.ie. It's a good place to start, and you can always email us here in the branch in Birdwatch Cork or head office, Birdwatch Ireland, and we'd be very happy to give you advice on the type of binoculars that would suit your pocket best, both financially and size-wise. Definitely worth thinking about. So when you've got your notebook, your identification guide, and maybe even your binoculars, what's left to do? Well, start looking at the birds, start identifying them. And what do you look out for? The sort of things, very simple things you look out for are things like the body shape. I can identify these three birds just on body shape. I don't need to see any of the colors of the bird, none of the patterns of the feathers, nothing like that. I know there's a wren on my left, a magpie in the middle, and a blue tit on the right. So body shape can be important. And if you can write down, that, it has the body shape of a wren or has the body shape of a robin, that's a great start, because that's the shape sorted. And your initial impressions are usually correct if you've got reasonable view of it. Yeah, it looks like a sparrow, but then that's plenty. That's all you need there. Body shape is important. Other things that you'd want to be looking out for too are the shape of the beak. Different birds have different shaped beaks depending on what they feed on. And that can be a clue to identifying it. And it can narrow down the possibilities. So if you've got a robin, which is normally an insect eater, they'll eat worms as well, but they have a narrow pointed beak. You've got the pigeon, which is a thicker beak, but short. You have the finches, like the greenfinch, which is triangular. And then you have something like the rook, which is a big, long, conical beak for the size of the bird. And here's just briefly a warning that birds don't always come in the same shape and size. These are both jackdaws, and crows are birds that sometimes have deformed beaks. So the jackdaw on the right has a very strangely deformed beak. But yeah, you shouldn't have to worry about things like that normally. But it is a possibility. Tail shape can be important too. If you look at the shape of the tail, it can help you identify or narrow down the possibilities. Most good books will tell you the shape of the end of the tail, and there's the different types. So again, if you can see it and it's got a notch in it, it may be a finch, because most members of the finch family have a very noticeably notched tail. There are different birds have different shaped tails, and that can help narrow down the possibilities. With a little bit of practice, you can get down a really good description of your mystery bird very fast before going to your book. Feather patterns. Is it a plain looking bird? Has it got patterns on it? Like, does it have a face pattern like the goldfinch on the left? Does it have wing stripes or wing bars, they're sometimes called, like that big yellow bar on the wing? It's got spots on the wing as well. Whereas you look at the female blackbird, it's just chocolate colored really, and it's got yellow on the beak. The patterns can be important. So how does it strike you as being complex patterns or very plain looking bird? Again, so all those things are important to keep an eye out for, okay? Juvenile plumage is another thing that you you got to keep an eye out for. This time of year, it's not so much of a problem, but something to bear in mind in September and even into earlier mid-October. Some birds will look just like the adults after they've left the nest. Others look substantially different. And here's a few examples. The young wood pigeon doesn't have a white collar. The young robin doesn't have a red breast. The young bullfinch doesn't have a black cap on the head. And the young goldfinch doesn't have the complex head pattern of the adult. Now, thankfully, these plumages on these particular birds only last a number of weeks. And by this time of year, they have molted all their body feathers and look just like the adults. But earlier in the season, you may get confused with a bird that kind of looks like a goldfinch, but the head's all wrong. But again, if you've done your homework and you write down about the pattern of the wings and the colors on the wings and the shape and the size, you should still be able to identify it. Feather mold. It's when birds replace old feathers with new ones. And almost all birds do this at least once a year. So here's a starling with the plumage just after it's left the nest. Then a number of weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, it starts molting and it changes from the juvenile into plumage like an adult by this time of year. So you may get a bird with the plumage that's looking a bit funny, but I've always paid a lot of attention to the shape of the bird as well, because one thing that rarely changes between an adult, a young bird, a bird that's changing its feathers, is the shape of the bird, the size and the shape. That can be a hint, because often the shapes are very characteristic, like I said earlier. So even if the feathers aren't looking quite right, the size and shape of the bird, the proportions, like how long is the beak, is it relatively long, relatively short, you know, the length of the wings, how far do the wingtips project down along the tail. Some birds have short, stumpy wings, others have quite long and slim wings. All those things can help you identify your mystery garden bird. Some birds get their summer plumage, like the house sparrows, by the tips of the feathers in the autumn wearing away during the winter and spring. And you can see on the right, the sparrow, the male house sparrow, has a bib, whereas the one on the left doesn't. But if you look carefully at the one on the left, you can see the dark part of the feathers starting to show through already. Dark feathers with pale tips. As the winter progresses and UV light makes pale feathers brittle quicker than dark ones, the tips break off and fall away, and it exposes then the dark part of the feather underneath, and that's how it ends up with the dark bib. And you can see there that the beak changes color from a yellowish gray in the winter to all dark in the summer. So feather wear can affect the appearance of a bird too. The light conditions, they can make a bird look like two different species, depending on whether the light is coming from behind or from the side or front on. Like these photos showing a wren in bright light and a wren in shade. They look possibly like two different species, but they have the same plumage, same colors. It's just that one is in bright light and one is in dark light. Then there is a thing called GISS. That's GISS, which stands for General Impression of Size and Shape. And in Cork, we have a word for it. We call it the gatch of someone, a swagger. You know the members of your family, not because of the clothes they're wearing, or the makeup, or the jewelry. You can tell them from the other end of the street solely on the way they walk, the proportions of their body, the size, tall and thin, short and stout. Do they walk fast? Do they walk slow? Do they walk with a bounce? That's all the general impression of size and shape, or as I said for short, the jizz or the swagger, or as we say in Cork, the gatch of someone. And that kind of thing that's hard to put a finger on is as applicable to birds and other animals as it is to human beings. And With time, you can actually identify a bird without, again, seeing any of the detail and not having to see it side on or in good light or facing you or facing even the slightest kind of view of it eventually. And with some birds, even for some of you starting out, you can probably do it and you don't even know it. It's just, it is a wren. It can't be anything else. And so that's a kind of a part of identifying a bird that is hard to describe, but you get to know them by their gait, by their swagger, by the way they hold themselves, by their gait. And these are hard things to write down. But as you get familiar, you get to know them. And then if a bird you don't know comes into the garden, you kind of go, there's something not quite right about that. I think it's a wren, but it's not really, there's something not right about it. And usually when you have a hunch like that, it can be a new bird or a different bird, or what it can be sometimes is a wren acting funny. And that is also a possibility. By the way, when you see the length of a bird written down in most bird books, it's actually referring to the bird when it's laid out straight, just like in the picture here. So the length often seems longer than what the bird looks like to you. Wingspan is another one. Wingspan is from wingtip to wingtip when they're outstretched. That's the length from wingtip to wingtip, whereas wing length is just one wing. Might seem a little bit obvious, but I just said I'd put that in. So in case you see wingspan in an identification guide, it's when the wings are wide open. And again, it often seems a lot bigger than what you're looking at. And that's because the birds don't often, except if something like a buzzard, like this silhouette, they rarely stretch their wings straight out, okay? So that's they're just to be aware of that. We have a name for pretty much every part of a bird. And if you want to do a very detailed description, you need to know all these. But to be honest, for most garden birds, unless you're talking to someone, you can call the parts of a bird whatever you like, once you know what they are, and it helps you then to go to a book and identify your mystery bird. So to summarize, things you need to take note of are the size of the beak, the shape of the beak, the color of the beak, shape of the body, length of the tail, patterns or no patterns, then movement or behavior, very important too. They're kind of the main things. Leg color is another one, you know. So they're the main things to write down if you can. Going back briefly to my little sketch that I showed you at the start, with that little sketch and just 11 words on a piece of paper, I got everything I needed to identify my mystery bird as a chaffinch. Well, now that I've given you some pointers on how to go about identifying a mystery bird in your garden, I'm going to focus on some of the harder to identify species that might turn up. I won't be able to cover every bird that might turn up in your garden, but based on my experience of people asking me in the past, I am just going to focus on a few of the more difficult species that you might come across, using the techniques we have already discussed to identify these birds. Well, I'm calling this the tit group because the long-tailed tit up on the right is not as closely related to the others as we thought it was. It just looks and behaves like them, but scientifically speaking, it's a bit more distant relative than the other three. So long-tailed tit is easy enough. Pinkish, tail longer than the body, and it's got a white punk line down the center of the head. Blue tit, if you get a blue cap on a bird in your garden, it's a blue tit, almost certainly, unless it's something that's escaped from a cage somewhere. So those two I'm not going to spend time at, but the other two people have trouble with. That's the grey tit and the coal tit. They can have trouble identifying them. If you get a good view from the front, the grey tit is bigger, quite yellow usually, with a dark line down the center of the breast and belly. It's much more obvious on the male than on the female, whereas the coal tit, which is smaller, much colder colors and doesn't have any form of a dark line down the center of the breast and belly. But when you get them on a feeder like this, they look similar. And you wonder, how do I separate the two of these out when they come to the feeder? Well, firstly, anyway, the coal tit is smaller, but that can be very hard. If the bird is on its own, very hard to tell that it's smaller than a grey tit. So you're looking at the plumage. And these are the key features that I usually use or to show somebody. The black on the side of the head of the grey tit comes down and around and encloses that white cheek patch, as we often call it, on the grey tit. Whereas on the coal tit, it doesn't. There's no black underneath, okay? That's number one. Number two, the coal tit has two pale wing bars. A wing bar is where some feathers on the wing have white tips on them and they form a pale line. Sometimes it might be a dark line on a light background, but basically it's where you get the feather tips forming what looks like a line on the wing, and we call it a bar or a wing bar. The grey tit, on the other hand, has only one wing bar. And then you've got the overall colour. Grey tits normally, especially adults, have a yellow underneath, yellow breast and belly, with a black line down the middle. The coal tit, it's more buff coloured. And overall, the coal tit is a much more muted, colder colours than the grey tit. So watch out for that. And here are the key features together. And you'll get used to them when you practice, okay? So this is the sort of thing we look out for when we're bird watching. Now with a coal tit, if you get a view like this and you see this long white stripe down the back of the head, there is no other bird in the garden that normally has that big white stripe down the back of the head. If you look at the grey tit and you look at them side by side, it might have the very start of one at the top, but it doesn't have the white stripe coming down the back. We often call this, for the coal tit, a diagnostic feature. If you see that on the bird, there's no other bird in your garden that I can think of that has the dark head with the white stripe down the back of the head only. A long-tailed tit has a stripe going right down from the beak, top of the head and down the other side. It doesn't have just that piece on the back of the head, okay? So that's the clincher, as we say, for a coal tit, if you're not sure. That's the distinguishing feature. So write everything down. Finches and sparrows, again, some of them are easy. Goldfinch, the male and female look almost identical, very colourful, should be easy enough. Male bullfinch, again, if you just take down the briefest of description, you should be able to eliminate all other birds than that. The female is duller looking, but she's got the same body shape, the same body patterns even, and the same gatch, as I said, the same kind of jizz. The red poll, not a very common visitor to the garden, but very distinctive. If you get a good look at the head and you'll see that red forehead on the bird, that really is the red poll. Siskin and greenfinch, they're both kind of yellowish with dark feathers as well, but they're fairly easy to tell apart if you get a little description of it. No, but it's the others down the bottom, the chaffinch and the house sparrow. The males tend to be okay. They're not too bad, as you can see. A lot of patterns in the plumage, pretty distinctive and not that easy to confuse with other garden birds. But look at the females. I mean, those two look almost identical. I know a lot of beginners might call this a house sparrow, and I wouldn't blame them when you see it. But when you see them side by side, then you can kind of start seeing differences. And this is, again, where taking a brief description of the bird can help a lot. Because if you look, the female chaffinch usually has very obvious white wing bars, two of them. You can see it there in the left-hand picture. Whereas the house sparrow usually has just one prominent pale wing bar. And if you look at the back on them, the female chaffinch has a relatively plain back. It has no obvious pattern, whereas the back of the female house sparrow is very distinctively striped. And the beak is different. On the chaffinch, it's normally a kind of a silvery grey colour, whereas on the house sparrow, it can range from kind of a grey yellow in the winter to all black in the summer and everything in between, but is never that kind of silver gray that you get on the chaffinch. So you can learn to separate these two very similar species by paying close attention to all these features. So don't be afraid. Take your notes, wing patterns, what is striking you is obvious on it, color of the back, beak shape, beak color, leg color, stuff like that. And you should be able to identify them with confidence. And then you go to your book with your notes. That's what I would do, especially with two birds like this. And here they are on the feeder. These are not photoshopped. The chaffinch, female chaffinch, chased away the female house sparrow on the left. So I conveniently had the male house sparrow there. You can see it at the back, wondering what's going on. And when you see them side by side like this, you can see the difference, especially on the stripes on the back of the house sparrow on the left and a relatively plain back on the female chaffinch. Then you might get something like this, and you're wondering, what the hell is this? And you won't have the name down in the bottom left-hand corner of this photograph to help you. This is a Dunnock, and it looks a little like a house sparrow. And in fact, an old name for the Dunnock was a hedge sparrow. And that's because the Dunnock looked just like a sparrow. So people thought that they were closely related, hence the name hedge sparrow. But in fact, they're not closely related at all. They just happen to look kind of the same. Put them side by side. Now you're even starting to see differences when they're side by side. And again, it's only by taking note of the features of the bird. I'm like a stuck record. I'm repeating myself over and over, but I cannot stress it enough. Take down notes on the body shape, obvious patterns, the beak shape, the beak size, the legs, the color, anything like that. Just take down those notes straight away, what your first impressions are. Get as much of that down as you can. Remember the sketch? Use that to write down as quickly as possible as many of the features of the bird as you can before it flies away. Look at the difference in the beak. Dunnocks are mainly insect eaters, fine little narrow beak compared to the triangular beak of the house sparrow. That's the first difference. Unlike the house sparrow, the Dunnock has a pencil grey colour on the neck and a little bit on the breast and belly. It also has streaking on what we call the flanks. That's the side of the belly, just under the folded wing. Record the leg colour. Dunnocks generally have a reddish legs. Sparrows, they're usually dull grey-brown colour. And then, believe it or not, even the eye colour can be different in general. Dunnocks will have reddish brown iris, whereas the house sparrow, it's usually dark brown and looks black. Okay. Another small brown bird that might cause confusion with the Dunnock is the wren. Now, one feature of the wren that you can look out for is the way it holds its tail. Almost always, it has the tail cocked up in the air. The Dunnock almost never has the tail up in the air, and that alone can help you show the difference. And look at the size as well. The Dunnock is a bigger bird, but the tail cocks up on the wren usually, not always, but usually, whereas it doesn't on the Dunnock. Plain back on the wren, pretty much, spotted and striped on the Dunnock. Again, that'll separate it. And then there's little bars on the wing of a wren, and there's none on that of the Dunnock. So keep an eye out for that. The thrushes, these are the three main ones. There's one other thrush that you can get in the garden. It's called the fieldfare, but that's much rarer, and I'm not dealing with that tonight. But these three, the redwing is relatively easy to identify. It comes to us from Iceland and Northern Europe, and it's a winter visitor. But it's got a big white eye stripe. See that stripe over the eye? Massive white eye stripe. The other two thrushes do not have that. And it's also got red under the wing from which it gets its name. And if that's not enough for you, it's more streaked than spotted. Okay, that's the redwing. So when we get rid of that, and it's not a redwing, then is it a missel thrush or is it a song thrush? As you can see here, you have the missel thrush on the left, and you have the song thrush on the right. Missel thrush is bigger than the song thrush. And if you look closely, the song thrush's spots are often described as chevrons, spearhead shaped or triangular, whereas those on the Mistle thrush are more like spots. They're more spread out and they're bigger. Another difference between the two of them, the mistle thrush, the feathers of the wings tend to have pale edges on them. So it looks like quite scaly on the wings compared to the song thrush, which usually, especially the adults, not so scaly at all. And do you notice the difference in color as well? The brown on the song thrush is much warmer than that of the mistle thrush. I often get calls about, small, medium-sized, dark garden birds. Right, well, these are the ones that you normally get. The two on the left are the starlings. Lots of spots. In the summer or the winter, lots of spots. So they're easy enough to identify. So then you're left with the blackbird, and the blackbird has a variety of relatively similar plumages, which can cause a little bit of trouble when you're trying to identify them. The female is not black, it's actually a dark chocolate brown. And younger birds, they can look very spotted, so they can be off-putting. For a bird watcher starting out, the female or young blackbird can actually be confused sometimes with the song thrush. I often get phone calls from people and they tell me they've got a bird in the garden that they can't identify and it's brown with a spotty breast. Right, well, not all birds that are brown with a spotty breast are indeed song thrushes or mistle thrushes, and you have to look a little bit closer to figure them out. This blackbird at the bottom of your screen is a young blackbird. This was taken in the end of September, and they can have this plumage even in October or November, and it does look like it has spots. But look at the song thrush. It's a white background with very distinctive, the spotting or chevrons on it. Whereas the blackbird, it's a pale brown, everything is brown, and those spots are not very strong in their marking either. And it's actually more than a coincidence. They are cousins. They're members of the thrush family, the song thrush and the blackbird. A female blackbird in her first winter, the one on the top left, also can have traces, very faint traces of spotting. But as you can see, nothing like on the song thrush. So they shouldn't be that difficult to separate when you get a good look. But as you can see, very similar in shape. Very similar in gatch or jizz or swagger. At times in certain light, they can look very similar because they're close cousins. So body shape is similar. The leg color is also different. It's much paler on the song thrush than on the blackbird. Now, there's another group that might come into your garden as well, which is the pigeons and the doves. And they can cause a bit of trouble. Here they are. And there's usually 3 species to be dealing with in the garden. And the 2 main ones are the wood pigeon and the collar dove. They should be fairly easy to identify. The wood pigeon normally has that white patch on the side of the neck. That is a wood pigeon. And the half collar, black collar, on a very sandy, more gentle and smaller pigeon-like bird is actually the collared dove. So they should be fairly easy. But where things can get confusing is this lot. These are all the one species. These have been domesticated from a species called the rock dove. What you're looking at here are all the same species, the feral pigeon, the racing pigeon. They can sometimes even have rings on them like the one on the top left. The plumages are all different, but the shape is generally pretty much the same. So if it doesn't fit the wood pigeon or the collar dove, it's almost certainly a racing pigeon or a feral pigeon. Finally, the crows. The magpie is easy, long tail, black and white. Sometimes they lose their tail feathers, but the body is still black and white all the time. Hooded crow, black wings, black tail, black hood on the head, rest of the bird grey or greyish brown. Easy enough, and big birds. So the 2 that can cause the trouble in your garden are these 2, the jackdaw on the left and the rook on the right. Rook is much bigger than the jackdaw. Look at the beak shapes even. If you just noted the shape of their beaks, you'd nearly have them identified almost straight away. Pretty much all dark, usually looking, but look at the head colors. The jackdaw silver on the head. The rook never has silver on the head. And if you can get a close look, the jackdaw always has a pale blue iris. Very striking. The rook has a dark eye. Their body shape is also different because the jackdaw has a shorter, stubbier beak and longer feathers on the head and neck. It gives it a bigger headed appearance. Finally, just briefly, the Garden Bird Survey. Give it a go. You can download the survey form from the birdwatchireland.ie website. You put in your name and address, size of your garden. It's not a daunting form to fill out. It started last Sunday, but again, if you only do a week or two or do the rest of it, all the information is very valuable. And also, folks, even if you can only identify robins in your garden and you record them during the survey, which goes on till February, it's worth doing. And you give them the size of your garden. Do you put out food? It gives us the information that we can use. You can see it there. It tells you about your garden. And then the next one up is are you getting birds that are sick? Where we also want to find out, are the birds that are coming to your garden, are they healthy? Is there a problem with a disease that might be spreading through the population? Those sort of things are also helpful. And then this is great fun. All you got to do is every week you get out your form, you can download it, you can print it off, and then you can record your observations of the birds in your garden. And what you do is you just record the maximum number of each species you see in a week. So if you see one robin on a Monday and you see two on a Wednesday and one on a Thursday and one on a Friday, then you just put two at the end of the week because two was the most. We don't want to be adding them all up because you might have the same bird every day and you'll put down 5, even though it's only the one bird that's been using your garden. And even if you don't put out food for birds in your garden, you can still take part because the most important information we're looking for is how valuable are gardens for birds. So we're just interested in birds that come into your garden either to drink water or to take natural foods or to rest or to take food put out for them. The most important thing we're trying to find out is how valuable are gardens for Irish birds. So you don't have to be putting out food for them to take part. It's great fun to do on your own. And if a family is doing it, it can get quite competitive. I've seen three magpies. I've seen 4 blackbirds, and it's a great way to get the kids going because it gives a focus for your garden bird watching. It's a really great idea. Even if you make a mess of it, give it a go. And what we do in our house is we use a little blackboard. Anyone in the house, if they go to the board and say, I've had 2 wrens, and they rub it out and they put in 2, and I come and says, who saw the second wren? It's such good fun. This is really, really good fun. It's also a great way for you and your family to learn all about the birds that are just outside your window. And yes, we had a dragon one year that you can see down in the bottom right. You never know what you're going to see in the garden. Really, 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 really great fun. By submitting your records at the end of the survey in February, you will be helping us to keep an eye on the health of the birds that visit gardens all over Ireland, which is a vital part of Birdwatch Ireland's activities. And this survey has been running since 1987, and the data we have collected has shown quite a lot of dramatic changes in the fortunes of Irish garden birds. So please submit your records at the end of the survey. To help you folks, on our branch website, birdwatchcork.com, on the publications page, you can download this little poster, A4 poster, of the main birds you'll get in your garden during the winter. There's a couple of summer birds there as well, the swallow and the chiffchaff, so you can use it all year round. And we have little tick boxes on it, so if you can print it off in color if you can, but if not, even in black and white, and you can see how long it'll take you to see all those species in your garden. You can even do it when you're going on your walk as well. We had it during the first lockdown and it proved very popular. So that's the talk, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're not a member of Birdwatch Ireland, I would recommend that you join it. You get quarterly newsletters. You get a lot of information about talks and outings when we're able to go back out and do outings. And it's great to be able to share the passion and the interest in birds. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, the more you look, the more you see, and the better you'll get at identifying the birds in your garden.